Who was the main villain of Arcane? It's not who most of you would think. It's important to piece all the puzzle together to see the full picture. Heimerdinger. So, first of all, it's important to clarify who Heimerdinger is and what his role entails.
But Heimerdinger favors him?
As far as I can tell.
Contrary to the stereotype often perpetuated by the fandom, he is not just a scientist in Piltover. He is, in fact, the true founding father of Piltover. He is the only individual who has been on the council from the very beginning, essentially building it from the ground up and participating in nearly every meeting during his 200-year tenure. Why is this extremely important? Because almost every single event that unfolds throughout Arcane stems from his, Piltover's, willful ignorance. Allow me to elaborate. When you peel back the layers of his actions, or rather, his inactions, what emerges is a deeply flawed individual whose ignorance and passivity caused more harm than most of the show's overt villains ever did. For 200 years after the city's foundation, Heimerdinger sat relatively comfortably in Piltover, never once crossing the bridge into Zaun. He watched as the city below was suffocated by toxic factories, its air polluted, its water poisoned, shimmer rise, entire generations condemned to lives of suffering and disease. And while he may not have been physically present in Zaun, he undoubtedly knew of its plight. Over the years, being part of the council, he would have heard reports during countless council meetings about the rising tensions, the escalating conflicts, and the civil war that tore through the Undercity, the war that killed Vi and Jinx's parents. Yet, even as these issues were brought to his attention, he chose not to take responsibility. He may have feigned ignorance, closed his eyes to the suffering, or simply chosen not to see it. But that is never an excuse. Before you say, he didn't know, it was kept from him. He had access to people like Viktor, individuals who lived through Zaun's harsh realities, whose very lives were shaped by its systemic exploitation. But instead of actually listening to their stories, instead of using his immense intellect to alleviate their suffering, he turned a blind eye.
I think it has something to do with gases in the fissures where he grew up. Exactly the sort of thing we wanted to fix with Hextech.
Other scientists were also aware of what was happening in Zaun. This was such common knowledge that even the Kiraman family, a wealthy and privileged household from Piltover, took steps to improve Zaun's conditions by building a ventilation system to mitigate the toxic air. And yet, in all his centuries of invention, there isn't a single known creation of Heimerdinger's designed to improve the quality of life for Zaunites. For someone so celebrated as a brilliant innovator, this glaring omission is not just negligence. It's outright apathy. Heimerdinger's failure lies not just in his inaction, but in the very system he helped create. He, or rather his neglect and ignorance, built a council, a governing body that should have upheld principles of equity and progress, but instead became a breeding ground for corruption and greed. Wealthy, self-serving individuals to infiltrate and manipulate the council to serve their own ambitions, undermining any pretense of morality. His passive leadership created a structure where systemic exploitation was not just tolerated, but normalized. Heimerdinger, of all people, should have seen these patterns emerge.
A burden that only I here carry. Time.
He lived long enough to witness the same issues rise and fall across generations of council members. While no other council member could have such a vast historical perspective, even a fraction of his time had been spent addressing Zaun's suffering. If he had taken just 0.1% of his time and brilliance and effort to improve their lives, Silco's generation could have grown up free from the crushing weight of exploitation. But Heimerdinger chose not to act, and that choice left Zaun to rot. As a result, Zaun began to devour itself. His inactions becomes even more damning when contrasted with other characters in Arcane. Heimerdinger had no external factors pressuring him in the present, no manipulation or desperation clouding his judgment. His inaction was purely a product of his own indifference. Jayce, despite his flaws, was manipulated by Mel, whose own motivations stemmed from her mother's influence. Caitlin, young and grieving, was similarly shaped by Ambessa's calculated exploitation of her emotional vulnerabilities. Or Viktor, who made rash decisions with the Hex Core out of desperation and feeling his twilight over and over again. These characters, despite their mistakes, were actively being influenced by forces far beyond their control. Heimerdinger, on the other hand, had none of these excuses. His failures were entirely his own. He could have chosen to inspire Jayce and Viktor, to guide them toward better solutions instead of Hextech, or a quickier, safer version. But instead, he was led by fear of the past, while Jay and V worked tirelessly to find ways to improve the lives of Zaunites.
We can be improving lives with Hextech now.
Professor, this could save Viktor's life.
Heimerdinger never used his genius to support them directly.
I will have it destroyed one way or another.
Instead, he watched from the sidelines, letting them struggle, give moral speeches, without actually lifting a finger to working on a compromise solution. What makes this even more infuriating is that if Jayce hadn't confronted him, driven by desperation over Viktor's condition.
And who holds you accountable?
What?
And if we consider Heimerdinger's initial reactions,
Jayce, you forget yourself.
without the exile, he likely would have continued his hypocritical attitude for another 100 to 200 years, instead of facing the truth, even after that conversation. And when he crossed into Zaun after losing his status, his presence wasn't the result of a long-awaited reckoning or the desire to make things right. Heimerdinger, in fact, first retreated when the Zaunites didn't welcome him warmly, rather than confronting the consequences of his neglect. Instead of acknowledging the decades of suffering he had ignored, he would have turned away again when faced with his own false hostility. His meeting with Echo wasn't the result of a deliberate effort to fix his mistakes, but rather a chance encounter, sparked not by Heimerdinger's determination, but by sheer happenstance. What makes this moment even more telling is how Echo never directly confronted Heimerdinger about his role in Zaun's suffering like he did with Kate. This lack of confrontation wasn't because Heimerdinger had earned Echo's trust or respect in the first moment. It was because Caitlin, and more specifically her relationship with Vi, had already softened Echo's perspective. Caitlin, in her own journey in Season 1, showed Echo that people from Piltover were capable of genuine change, paving the way for Heimerdinger to be accepted without facing the accountability he truly deserved. It's a glaring contrast to how Caitlin herself faced intense scrutiny from both Zaunites and fans alike, despite her efforts to challenge Piltover's corruption and her relative youth and inexperience compared to Heimerdinger's 200 years of governance. The issues with Heimerdinger's character only deepen when examining his actions, or lack thereof, in the alternate universe. After spending 1,128 days, nearly 3 years in this world, his contributions were negligible. By the time Heimerdinger arrived in this timeline, around 4 years had passed since Vi's death, and Zaun was already well into a period of progress and reconstruction. The pivotal changes began 4 years before his arrival, making it clear that Zaun's progress day, overall 7 years in the AU after Vi's death, he witnessed was not a result of his efforts. His eventual on-screen death in this universe, while tragic, felt more like an escape from responsibility rather than a meaningful redemption. It was a single act of courage in the face of a 200-year legacy of indifference, and it did nothing to erase the harm he allowed to perpetuate for generations. He left all the burden on Echo's shoulders. Of course, Echo was the best person for this, but overall, it wasn't fair to push the resolution of centuries of mistakes onto the person who was also one of the greatest sufferers of it all. Does Heimerdinger one noble act outweigh centuries of apathy and neglect? Heimerdinger's journey and ultimate fate raise questions such as why it is always the burden of the younger generation to correct the mistakes of their predecessors.
No matter what happened in the past, it's never too late to build something new. Someone worth building it for.